Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Hassan, and to the organizers. It's a great pleasure to be speaking to you today, exploring Sudan's rich architectural heritage. I've already learned a lot from the other speakers. And it seems like a really rich group and organization you're setting up. So I look forward to more research coming out of this endeavor as well. My own contribution today is going to be through a discussion of one building, All Saints Cathedral, built in the ground of the Governor General's Palace in the early years of the 20th century. The key years really are between sort of 1906 and 1912, although the completion of the building isn't really until the late 1920s, early 1930s, when the tower is completed. Before I move to discussing its relationship with style and the concept of the modern, our theme today, it's worth outlining my original research interest in the church and the period, as this is a building that's been central to my own development as a historian. Taking this approach will, I hope, help bring in questions of funding and environment and understanding the building alongside more design-oriented and execution questions. I'm going to stay on this first slide for quite a long time, so don't worry and think that my slides are broken. I was a master's student in urban history when I first became interested in Khartoum's place in the British Empire, which we've already heard some things about, but I want to sort of add a little bit. The city, and the Sudan in general, had an ambiguous place within Britain's colonial system. It was Britain that Sudan was ruled as a condominium, as we've already heard, but it was Britain that held political power, while the funding for the region was extracted from Egypt initially and then later from Sudan itself. The chief reason that Britain wanted to control Sudan in the first place was to monitor and control the waters of the Nile flood in order to serve their agricultural holdings in Egypt. But as well as these purely practical concerns, Sudan's capital region was also the site of two celebrated episodes in Britain's imperial narrative, the story it told itself about its empire. The first was the death of Charles Gordon in trying to hold the city against the Mahdi in 1885. And then the second was the reconquest of Sudan, led by Herbert Kitchener, which we've already heard a little bit about, recorded by numerous writers, including a young Winston Churchill. So there are key figures in the history of British colonialism, and the stories around it are tied up with Sudan and the conquest of it. The building of the new Khartoum after this reconquest was not a grand undertaking of the colonial state in the way that the building of New Delhi in India was, but it was still presented by the British press as a thorough modernization of urban space. In short, for a historian with an interest in the place of urbanism and architecture in British colonial ideology, Sudan's capital region was and remains a fertile site for investigation. It was with these interests that I first approached the history of All Saints. I was specifically wanted to trace its funding. Money for the church was raised from colonial visitors to Sudan and through appeals in the British press. Working my way through the minutes of the church committee, which are held at Durham University, in archives that may be familiar to some of you, I grew to understand how both the environment of the site and the tenuous funding of the project had shaped the creation of the building. The first newspaper appeals for funds were fairly dry affairs, seeming to take it for granted that the British public would be keen to open their wallets for a first Anglican church in Khartoum. As the years went on, the committee adopted new approaches, explicitly connecting the church with the legacy of Charles Gordon, putting a specific price on a brick so that they could claim each donation of that value was another brick added to the church building project. This discourse around funding appeals seemed to me to shed light on how a colonial culture was reproduced. The building here became caught up in narratives of imperial mission. The association of the church with Gordon stuck and was still used in the newspapers when the church was consecrated in 1912. This despite the fact that Gordon's family had asked the church committee to stop using his name in their appeals. In spite of all the changes to wording, the strategizing around audiences, every appeal by the committee raised less money than hoped, and at the time of the consecration, the architect described the building as absolutely unfinished. Robert Schultz was a Scottish-German architect working in the arts and crafts tradition with academic expertise in Byzantine architecture. All Saints is his only building outside Britain. The Church Committee initially worked with Ernest Rutherford from the Cairo Public Works Department and wanted a building in a Byzantine style, drawing on the royal mausoleum at Frogmore, the resting place of Queen Victoria and her consort, Prince Albert. If we look at these images of the mausoleum, we can see that it is a compact building on a cruciform layout with rounded arches on the windows and an octagonal central sepulchre. The building was suggested as a potential inspiration to the Khartoum Church Committee by Princess Henry of Battenberg, Victoria's granddaughter, who laid the foundation stone for All Saints in 1904. Rutherford prepared plans according to this brief, but these were at first considered far too expensive, and when he modified them, the committee didn't like his proposed solutions. They therefore decided to approach a more experienced London-based architect with some sort of expertise in Byzantine architecture, and Schultz was one of the names that was given to them as a potential candidate for this. While it was true that Schultz was an expert on Byzantine architecture, this did not mean that he was likely to be keen to recreate it in Sudan. He was convinced that the art of building was poorly served by architectures obsessed with style, and indeed by architects in general. I'll say more about this later on. Buildings ought to emerge, he thought, from a close relationship with and study of the site. His first request, on being approached by the committee, was for a sample of the soil on which the church would be built. The committee supplied several to represent the soil at different times of year, as it was transformed by the Nile's flood from a loose, dry sand into something far heavier, denser, and wetter. It was this correspondence about soil that led me to thinking about the environmental history of buildings, how water and earth play into architectural and urban form. This approach guided my PhD project, in which I study the Nile as a historical actor, the making of the colonial built environment. Climate was also central to Schultz's concerns in designing the church. The windows were small and shaded to protect the internal space from the heat of the sun. You can see the window shadings in this rendering here. The whole building was raised on a platform to limit the amount of dust piling up in the doorways, which is also visible here. You can see the steps going up to it. For the same reason, there were entrance doors on three sides of the entryway, so that if one were overly dust-filled, others could still be used. The earth under the church shaped Schultz's thinking too. He was concerned that the changeable conditions described by the committee might threaten the structural integrity of the building, so he proposed extensive concrete foundations to secure the ground. He was rather reassured by the slow trickle of funding, as it meant that building could only progress slowly, piece by piece, so that any structural issues would become clear while still fixable, rather than after the building was already completed. He had incorporated this into his design proposal for the church by proposing a tower, but not one integral to the main structure. It could be built at the same time as the main building if there was sufficient funding, or later if not. Here's a drawing of the church with tower, and you can see from the plan in the top left that the tower is really a separate structure joined onto the church rather than integral to it. This kind of flexibility and responsiveness to the site and to the funding situation is no doubt what commended Schultz to the committee. And although they did occasionally voice concerns at how expensive his personal fees were, especially when he visited Khartoum, there were no major complaints about him or his work. Indeed, even though the church, as built, was far from being Byzantine, his designs also usually met with warm approval from the committee members. One other distinctive feature of how All Saints was built should be mentioned and plays in a similar way. There were few skilled stonemasons in Sudan at the time. Schultz therefore attempted to simplify the design wherever possible. Windows were not arched, but ended in points, which I think we can see on the next, you see this better in this plan here. There was little in the way of complex detailing, and what there was concentrated at one end of the church, so that it might be built last once effective working practices had been established. The more technical work, which was often rather grudgingly referred to as semi-skilled work, was carried out largely by Greek contractors, while local workers conducted the bulk of the labor, which colonial officials considered unskilled. Of course, in using these terms, I don't mean to fully endorse the idea that that labor was unskilled. Certainly, the physical movement of stone from the Gebel Auli mining site was a complex affair. And you could also add that as stone building in the style of an English church was new to Sudan, it was not indeed surprising that local workers were not exactly experienced in it. I imagine you would have had the same effect if you had tried to build in mud brick in England, or indeed you would still have that effect. So that's a little narrative of the sort of development of the church. And in my remaining time, I'd like to address two larger questions that this building raises in relation to broader architectural histories. One concerns style, and the other is about architectural practice. First of these questions, is rejection of style a step towards the modern, or is it some other kind of move? In 1904, Schultz, in a letter to the Western Mail, wrote of architectural style as a restriction on the development of architecture. It is possible, he argued, to erect a modern building that cannot be labeled with the name of a style of the dead past. He appealed to those commissioning buildings not to handicap, this is another quote, not to handicap their architects or builders by specifying style, but to content themselves with stating their actual requirements. What I plead for is fresh thought, a rational acceptance of modern building conditions and structural methods, and a straightforward tackling of modern problems. 5 years later, so during the building of All Saints, he would go so far as to say, this is another quote, I'm not hopeful that a good general type of modern building will be seen until all we architects are abolished, swept away root and branch, until the crafts connected with building are reorganized on an efficient educational basis. It is clear even from these short quotations that Schultz saw himself as wrestling with the challenge of modernity. For much of the 19th century, British architectural discourse, both within Britain and in its wider empire, had mostly been concerned with various battles and confrontations over style, Gothic versus classical, and to a lesser extent, classical versus Baroque. In very broad terms, the Gothic revival of the mid-1800s saw a fairly short-lived Gothic ascendancy produce buildings such as the Palace of Westminster in London or the Bombay High Court. This is some views of the inside of the church as designed, which gives you some indication of how the internal space is really echoing fairly conventional kind of English church practices of the time, but with some nice polychrome brickwork and such. The slide I was expecting is this one, illustrating Gothic revival architecture, the Houses of Parliament on one side of your screen and the Bombay High Court on the other. In India and other tropical colonies, the Gothic style that was referred to by these buildings often owed more to Venetian precedents than to the Northern European Gothic of England, France, and the Low Countries, and Germany that was the focus of much of the ideological support for Gothic. So I don't know, it depends really what you're viewing this on, but if you see the top right image here of the Bombay High Court, you can see that the way the arches, especially in the lower part here, these are very Venetian looking Gothic arches, much more than a sort of straight arch from a northern church would be. Schultz, who trained as an architect in the 1880s and traveled to study Byzantine architecture in the 1890s, entered the profession at a time when classical styles were once again ascendant. Although historians looking for the origins of architectural modernism might be more interested in arts and crafts movement or Art Nouveau, the characteristic architecture of the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the British Empire was what came to be known as the Edwardian Baroque. And I should mention my PhD supervisor, Alex Bremner, has a new book out on that, Building Greater Britain. This style, the Edwardian Baroque, may be the closest Britain ever came to an official state style and has been seen as a grand assertion of strength and significance by an official class already growing anxious about Britain's declining status as leading world power. Schultz then in what we have already heard, was working somewhat against the grain of architectural discourse at the time, and responses to the church in the British architectural press were rather mixed. The builder called it, quote, original and interesting, like nothing else one has seen in the way of a church, end quote. But it did also say that it could not be called beautiful. The Manchester Guardian argued that the building, quote, fails in the important quality of mass and is altogether unimpressive, although the architect has no doubt given many an interesting touch to the detail, end quote. On the other hand, the British architect was rather more appreciative, praising the church's mix of styles. It illustrates the capacity with which a modern architect may make use of his inheritance of traditional knowledge, for in it we realize that both Gothic and Byzantine art have been laid under contribution. Mr. Schultz has dealt in a masterly way with the study of Byzantine architecture, as our readers know, and some of the points of this study are to be found in the able design. For want of a better definition, we might perhaps call the design Sudanese, but we may feel sure that its simple dignity and solidity of effect will not be out of harmony with its surroundings, end quote. This emphasis on the hybridity of the architectural style has been an ongoing theme of analyses of All Saints. The most thorough scholarly piece on its style, or at least the most that I have come across, is by Robin Cormack in a chapter called Unity Out of Diversity, in which he takes colonial hybridity as his key theme. And I'm just going to move us back to an image of the church to remind us what we're discussing here. But if this is hybridity, it is of a somewhat strange kind, drawing extensively on traditions that may well not be British, but are just as clearly not Sudanese either. The role of Sudan in the making of this building is perhaps more rooted, or I think Schultz would urge us anyway to think that it is more rooted in the specifics of the site than in any general notion of architectural style. We have seen that questions of funding, climate, water, and land all play into the making of All Saints, and that its architects saw these as more fundamental than discussions of style. Modern architecture, contrary to Schultz's wishes, and perhaps proving his point about architects, developed into a specific style of its own in the decades following the building of the church. I want to suggest that we should perhaps view buildings like this not so much as prefigurations of the modernist movement, but rather more as alternative possibilities, the brief flowering or assertion of which went some way to opening the space for modernism, but which have their own distinctive intentions and characteristics. And my second closing question, just in the last couple of minutes, is, do colonial architectural practices prefigure the global architectural firms of later years that we live with in the contemporary world? I don't have time to go into this question in much detail, but I thought it worth glancing towards nonetheless. The building of the church was managed by a fairly complex set of groups and individuals with various different relations to the site. There was the church committee, which in many ways was the most consistently active group and was involved in all aspects of the project. There was the architect, who I've mostly been talking about today, whose involvement was likewise multifaceted, but who was rarely on the scene and so had to rely on correspondence with those closer to the site. The clerk of works, John Latimer, was a key figure in quarrying stone for the church. And the committee's technical representatives, first Captain Dunn of the Royal Military Engineers and later William Maclean, who we've already heard mentioned as Khartoum's town planner, played especially key roles in connecting these various groups. And there were also fundraising groups in London and even to a limited extent in North America. And of course, there were contractors in both Sudan and England. Latimer, the clerk of works, had an uncomfortable relationship with the church committee's technical representatives, especially in the later years of the project, when he appeared to increasingly view himself as the main person running the construction. He was lax in his correspondence with Schultz, who chided him for causing him stress and worry that was making him, Schultz, ill. In the key years of the rapid completion of the main structure, roughly around 1909 to 1912, Latimer was vital and could not be dispensed with because of his role in getting stone for the building, but the committee did move him on as soon as possible once the main construction was complete. It is hard to trace in the correspondence exactly how these working relationships broke down, especially as arguments often centered on Latimer's not writing often or quickly enough, which makes it difficult to trace in the archive. Perhaps it is not Perhaps it is not all that surprising that Schultz never worked on another building outside Great Britain. And what I want to leave you with, the question I want to leave you with, is whether one of the more interesting developments that happens through the colonial architectural system is exactly this sort of complex work across increasingly large distances, relying on remote communication. Of course, now we can enjoy the benefits of video calls, live chats, and other instant forms of communication. And the speed of air travel means that architects may be able to visit even different sites fairly regularly. Although in an era of climate crisis, we might begin to question that. Nonetheless, for those interested in thinking about the practical challenges of how buildings get made and tracing the practices around these when multiple groups working together or sometimes at odds with one another, I think there is a history here that is certainly well worth exploring more deeply, exploring, preserving, and indeed thinking with. So thank you very much. I hope that's been of interest.